I'm Femi OK. This week on The Stream, we are covering our climate crisis. Al Jazeera is teaming up with a consortium called Covering Climate Now. A whole group of journalists and organisations. Have a look here on my laptop, coveringclimatenow.org. We are going to be focusing on the science, not the politics, so we can bring you climate change and the climate emergency as the emergency that it really is, the biggest story of our lives right now.
In a new study by ActionAid and Climate Action Network South Asia, we find just in 5 countries of South Asia, 63 million people are going to be displaced by 2050 due to slow onset events like sea level rise, loss of ecosystems, and drought. And we are talking about a region which is already vulnerable to devastating cyclones and floods. People are losing their homes and incomes, and they have no coping mechanisms left.
Harjit there making the connection between climate change and migration, and that is where we're starting our climate change emergency week right now. If you have questions, if you have suggestions as to what do you do if people are having to move around the world because the climate is changing, you can jump into our YouTube conversation and be part of today's show. Joining us today, we have Kaylee, we have Hindu, we have Tasneem. Welcome, ladies. So good to have you. Kaylee, introduce yourself to our global audience.
My name is Kaylee Ober. I'm the Senior Advocate and Program Manager of the Climate Displacement Program at Refugees International.
Welcome. Hindu, nice to see you on the stream. Tell our audience who you are, what you do.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hindu Umaru Ibrahim. I am from Chad. I am an indigenous person from Mbororo pastoralist communities, coming from Sahel regions and advocating for climate adaptation and traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples around the world.
Thank you very much for representing. Appreciate you. And Tasneem, welcome to the stream. Introduce yourself. What do you do?
Hello, I'm Tasneem Siddiqui. I teach political science in the University of Dhaka. At the same time, for the last 30 years, I'm working on labor migration and climate-related migration in Bangladesh, and particularly adaptation. Climate change adaptation is my area of interest.
I mean, by this stage, Tasneem, we are beyond the is climate change impacting us? Absolutely it is. What are you seeing right now that is causing you the most concern?
We are most concerned that a large number of people are moving from rural areas to urban areas. But the thing is, the whole mindset of the society is that these people are bringing in disease, bringing in threat. So they are perceived as threat in urban location instead of looking them as victims of, climate injustice. They are treated as the problem, and the whole mindset is that how we can take them into rural areas back and then the urban live.
So I'm just going to pick up where Tasneem. Oh, yeah, so Tasneem.
So this whole mindset has to change.
Let me give our audience an idea of what is happening right now in some parts of Bangladesh where people are moving from rural to urban areas. Tanveer Chowdhury did this report in January. Have a listen, have a look.
Manu Ching lives in Bandarban Hill district in Bangladesh. She says a few years ago, villagers here grew an abundance of rice and vegetables, and the streams provided fish and drinking water, but not anymore. She says global warming has changed that.
Now it's much more difficult to get water since streams and wells dry up, especially in the winter. Now we have to walk so far to get water.
Losing their traditional way of life, many among the tribal population are now moving to urban settlements to find work.
We used to be farmers then, but now the environment has changed drastically. We're unable to farm anymore, compelling us to move to the town just to earn a living.
Tasneem, I see you nodding. That is something that resonates with you. You recognise that. Hindu is nodding. Kaylee is nodding. Tasneem, first of all, the biggest issue then right now with populations on the move.
Yes. I think so. That is the real issue. And the main thing is at a policy level, we are not looking into it. We have to have, certain policies that would try to provide them all kinds of services that decent living requires. And of course, population who are moving are not homogeneous. You have, sex, gender, and then you have geographic location wise. You have diversities. Children will have different needs, and elderlies would have others. So a policy that looks into how it is affecting everyone, and then coming up with how to make safe and sustainable cities inclusive of new migrants, that is the real challenge.
Hindu, I remember, oh my goodness, 20 years ago, I was covering stories about the shrinking of Lake Chad and how it's getting smaller and smaller. And then what were people doing this Lake Chad was this amazing body of water that just fueled so much industry and economics in the area. And now it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So we are seeing right now climate migration. What does that look like in Chad?
Absolutely. When we talk about the climate impact, I think we are really the face of it, because you can see exactly how it's happening, how people's migrating from one place to another one due to the resource scarcity. So the Lake Chad, who used to be in 1960, like 25,000 kilometers square of water. It was just when my mom get born. And right now, it is less than 2,000 kilometers squares. And sadly, you have more than 40 million people living and depending on it. And as I am coming from a pastoralist communities, so my peoples move from one place to another one to find water and pastures. So that means when we have the extreme weather events, from the flood to the drought, so it means the resources shrinking and people fight each other. And what they do, as Tasmin said, they have to leave the rural area to found the urban city. So for us, we call that internal migration. Of course, international level, people like to talk about the external migration, those who jumping the sea, going to Europe, but how about those who are leaving them regions, getting to another big city without getting any other work, and then beginning the slums and leaving the women and children behind. So the climate change is really a reality of migration around our region.
Kelly, you know what I've noticed? I've noticed that richer nations pay attention when migrants turn up on their borders and on their doorsteps. That is particularly happening, certainly in the southern part of the United States. But they're not necessarily going back to see the root causes. Let me just play you this little clip of a man from Honduras who is currently in Mexico and the explanation as to why he travelled there. Let's have a listen, Kaylee, and then you can pick up off the back of him.
Well, the truth is I had to emigrate from Honduras basically because of what's happening right now in our country with the rain, the hurricane. It's leaving many people homeless, without work, and that's aside from the coronavirus pandemic. Since the pandemic first started, and now with this, we're basically finished. Nearly every family is becoming homeless, losing their business. They have nothing. That's why the majority of people are coming to these places, because we have nowhere else to go.
Kaylee, certainly in the United States, certainly in Mexico, there's this awareness that there are people who cannot live in their home countries and they're on the move, but not necessarily the understanding as to why. Kaylee.
Thank you so much, Femi, for that intriguing interview, because I think it speaks to a couple of things. Climate change is not the only driver of migration. As Luis Fernando acknowledged, there's many intersecting things happening there in Honduras, and they've had prolonged and protracted drought for 6 or 7 years now. That's made the region very food insecure. It's made it very hard to grow your own crops and sustain yourself through traditional rain-fed agriculture and livelihoods. A lot of people have migrated to cities, but unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic really was a big economic shock and made it impossible for people to really earn a living. And then came these hurricanes, Eta and Iota, and they had a detrimental, an astronomical impact on certain countries within the region. And so it really was like the straw that broke the camel's back in many ways. And people are leaving their countries out of desperation because they are food insecure, because they're surrounded by violence, and they have governments that aren't really addressing those deep-seated issues. And so really they're just trying to find a safer and dignified life. And sometimes that means coming to the U.S. border.
Guess I have a question for you. And yes, Tasneem, go ahead. You go first, Tasneem.
Tasneem said, not what, she said about the food insecurity and why people's living. I think that's exactly giving me the example of my region. You know, when the rain didn't come right, or when the drought is continuously, so the man have the responsibility to feed them family culturally. And if they cannot feed them families, so their dignity is under threat. So this is the reason they have to leave the community to go to the big city. And most of them, when they come in the city, there is not enough work for them. And that's why they leave this city to jump to another one until crossing the Mediterranean and where they die there. And then, as you said, they leave the women and children behind. And most now, with the climate change, we are having also the young women who are leaving the communities. So food insecurity, it's driving with the climate change and making people losing their own dignity. So why not we cannot talk about migration, who is a threat for human dignity and who is a threat for our culture and identity. So I think I'm totally agree with what you said, and this is exactly what's happening on the ground.
Tasneem, go ahead.
I really liked when Kelly bring in this whole issue of COVID-19 and climate change. In Bangladesh as well, we have seen many of the without food, they had to go back to their rural origin, climate affected areas where they moved from there in the first place because of stresses, because of lack of income. But once they went there, then Cyclone Amphan again hit them. And if you think of India, Maharashtra was again hit with another cyclone. And these people, it's like a double, triple stress and followed by a flood. And one story I would like to share about, how a family was living on the top of their house roof with taking the bed up there. And then what they have to do, at night they were sleeping and it was all flooded. And one of the child just fell down from the bed, and in the morning mother didn't find that child anymore. So you can see the threats, real threat to life is there. So people will move, people will come to urban areas because it is a question of life and death.
Let us guests talk about mitigation, okay? Because we're already in this. This is not it's happening or it's about to happen. We are in our climate emergency right now. This is Adriana. And when we move forward, let's talk about now what do we do with the emergency situation we are in. And Adriana is a climate justice organizer. She has some ideas about tackling the root causes. Have a listen, have a look.
Honduras has been dealing with several compounding crises over the last year, facing violence at the hands of a narco regime that was imposed after a US-backed military coup in 2009, a deadly pandemic, and the devastating impacts of climate change. We cannot ignore the ways that neoliberal and imperialist policies have destabilized our communities and have been a key factor driving forced displacement over the years. Compounded with the impacts of climate change, most recently Hurricanes Eta and Hurricane Iota, we can see thousands more people who have been displaced. Climate change further exacerbates existing factors of forced displacement, and the response to forced displacement cannot be to increase border militarization, but instead must address the root causes of the problem.
I know you all have a take on this. Let's start with Kaylee. Go ahead, Kaylee.
Thanks so much, Femi. I love that Adriana really put a historical context and lens to the regional migration issues here. I mean, the U.S. has a responsibility, not just because it's propped up kind of these regimes in the past, but because it is the largest global emissions emitter over time, right? So I think first and foremost, the U.S. must re-engage in the region, which has been very much left behind by Trump administration policies, and ramp up its humanitarian assistance post-hurricanes and development aid to get out some of these root causes, this hunger issue, this ability to eke out a living from, tenuous cultural land. But it also requires kind of bigger sea changes here. It's not just how much money, it's how, who gets it, right? It should be to communities and households that need it the most, not national governments. And I think that would be the first thing that the U.S. should really, really do to address some of these root issues.
Go ahead, Hindu.
Yeah, when we talk about land right and land tenure, I think Andrea put it well. For indigenous peoples like my brothers and sisters who are in Pacific Islands, they're seeing them islands getting into water in them eyes. And they have to leave this place, and not just like leaving them lands, but leaving them identity, leaving them culture. It is cutting the peoples from the roots. Mm-hmm. The traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples is linked to our land, territories, and resources. And that is what is happening exactly. And it is the same like in the Sahel regions. My aunt and cousins were like they have to migrate. I can tell you like my grandmother from my mom with my grandfather and the families, just when I get born to now, they got moved from one place to another one more than 3 times, just because of lacking of the water, lacking of the resources, and they have to leave this land who is not fertile. So how about the children that coming later? So mitigation is very urgent. It is not just like a condition, but it is absolutely a reality. U.S. have this responsibility. When they come back to the Paris agreements, we all clap them. But it has to be with action, responding to the climate urgency, and responding it now. We cannot wait until 2050 or later. We wanted to have the solution now because our peoples are moving. What are we waiting for? We do not wait when the people's already dying and losing their own identities.
Let me put some of these YouTube comments to you, and guess I'm going to ask you to come back to them very quickly, just address them very quickly. Tasneem, I'm going to give you this one. This is from Brian Sanchez. Thanks, Brian, for being part of today's show. How many people are being displaced by climate change, and how is it expected to rise in the near future? That is a tricky question to answer, Tasneem, but I believe in you.
It used to be tricky.
Yes.
It used to be tricky, but you have data now. Mm-hmm. Like, 35 million people, 35 million people will be displaced in South Asia alone, and Bangladesh in a pessimistic situation, 13 million people will be displaced, and half of it will be climate induced. And on the policy issue, I just wanted to quickly add that along with that, at a national level, the policies has to be look into just not local level adaptation. It has to look into national strategy, and then connectivity and other things, large scale green funding should come to third world or countries like Bangladesh, where the overall development scenario is to be developed in such a way that people benefit from that. Climate-induced people also benefit equally from those development endeavors. And funds are, allocated on overall development in the country.
I want to play to you, again, we're still talking about mitigation, which is so how do we get through this emergency alive? This is Michael. Michael, again, is thinking about mitigation. What can we do?
Here's how the world can help avert a climate-induced migration disaster in South Asia. Find ways to direct donor support to jobs and opportunities in cities and urban areas so that you don't have as many people dependent on the agriculture, which is so vulnerable to climate change. Also, find ways to empower and support local and provincial government officials because they are the ones that are saddled with the responsibility of tackling climate change the most. Also, host dialogues and exchanges to try to promote better relations between the countries of South Asia because they often don't get along, but they need to be able to combat a shared threat. And finally, the U.S. should integrate climate change mitigation into its main Asia policy, its Indo-Pacific policy.
So we're not going to let Michael do all the heavy lifting there. Tasneem, another idea for mitigation. Share it with us. Go ahead, briefly.
Yes, I think this whole issue of decentralization is now important. In our part, it's all megacity development. So that megacity development has to be replaced by secondary city development, and then, diversifying work and jobs all over the country so that people move, people commute, but they don't have to go to few cities and then leave a very sort of dilapidated kind of situation.
Hindu, this is really interesting from Andy. Andy says that the people who are most vulnerable are the ones with little or no influence on the world stage. And Andy doesn't think that young representatives to the United Nations will help their case. You are a young representative. You are speaking up for your people. What difference are you making?
I think when you have voice, you can make the difference. You can be young African or young American. You have just to call the right issues. So like personally, I know that what is my call today? My call is how the developed countries take them responsibilities and the fossil fuel and all the greenhouse gases and move to the renewable. They have to do it now. How they can take them responsibility to put the real money in the tables for the climate adaptation and mitigation. Like my peoples cannot just move to just found them livelihood. I wanted to give the future of the children who can be in my home countries, who can learn my language, who can have the traditional knowledge, who can pass it through the generations. And it cannot pass if I'm not raising my voice, if I do not talk for them and talk with them. So it is time that all the young women who are taking the lead at the international level ask, demand, and make all these requests to become a reality for our peoples. Our peoples cannot continuously migrate. Climate change do not have a frontiers. We cannot have a visa to go to another place. We wanted to have the place in our home countries. And for that, developed countries must take them responsibility right now.
I'm going to give you, Kelly, the last word in the last minute of this part of our discussion. And that really is, you have been studying climate migration for some time now. What has changed? Are we getting better at managing it?
I think that there's a couple of realities that both Hindu and Tasneem spoke to, which is we know with certainty that climate change can exacerbate underlying inequalities or vulnerabilities that may induce people to migrate more. We know that a lot of that movement will be internal, rural to urban in nature, so we shouldn't be scared about people crossing borders and bombarding the EU or the US. And so we don't need to invest in border infrastructure the way the Trump administration did. We don't need to securitize borders the way the Biden administration is currently supplying financing for militaries in the region. What we need to do is understand that migration is an adaptation strategy, and it's a viable one. And we should ensure that when the migrants move to cities, they're friendly and climate resilient cities, right? We also need to just be realistic. People are on the move. And sometimes that means to cities, but sometimes that means across borders. And we need to create legal mechanisms to allow that movement to be dignified and safe.
Kaylee, Hindu, Tasneem, I know we only just got started and there's so much more to say, but I am going to put a pause for now and we will absolutely come back to you. We cannot tackle climate migration in just 25 minutes, but we had a good go, but we will come back to you. Thank you very much, ladies. Really appreciate you. So the Climate Emergency Week continues on the stream. In our next episode, we're going to be looking at the food that we eat, the food that we produce, and how that is adding to climate change and how we can fix it. Plus, across the whole Al Jazeera network, we are really primed for climate emergency and telling you the stories that matter. Have a look.
Climate change sticks out for me because it is the story of our times, and everything depends on how we handle it, from the way we live, to the way we eat, to whether or not we can live on a sustainable planet.
The land is drying up at the surface in several parts of the country, turning into a dust bowl. Families with no food to put on the table.
Planet's gotten hotter, movements have gotten larger, and have pushed centrist politicians like Joe Biden to do some things that would have been unimaginable just a couple of years ago.
I've come to Karnataka in India to find out how conservationists and locals took on the mining industry to win protected status for this land, the last remaining home in the world of the kolar leaf-nosed bat.
I know you are fascinated by that leaf-nosed bat. You will find out more in the new season of Earthrise, which starts this week. Climate Emergency Week continues on the stream in the next episode. See you then. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care.